I see trees of green.
I'm going to be talking to you about a piece of research that I was involved with over several years down in Tassie as part of my PhD, but also working with Zara and Private Forest Tasmania, who are now called the Tree Alliance, but they were sort of a state government farm forestry support network down in Tassie. And the work's all about farm scale benefits of agroforestry. So hopefully something that'll be of interest to people in the room. I want to start by saying just how much of a privilege it is for me to be talking to you today. Rowan's work was some of the first work that I read when I started my project, so he was a real inspiration for me, and still is. And I was lucky enough to go to Bamborough, to his property, and see his trees. There's a photo of my supervisor, Tom, standing with Rowan amongst the redwoods. So yeah, just a big thanks to Rowan. You know, I've always wanted to do this course myself, and to be able to be sharing some of my own work here today is a real treat. So thanks also to John for having us, and to Rita for inviting me to talk. So when I talk about this work, I like to start by zooming out a bit and thinking about the landscape and why I asked the sorts of questions that I did ask in my research. So this is the Northern Midlands of Tassie, but it's pretty typical of landscapes where we've really embraced the industrialisation of agriculture to feed and clothe growing populations. And what we tend to end up with is, although there might be trees along roadsides or along waterways or in reserve systems or patches of forestry, there tends to be very little integration of trees and other woody vegetation in the active agricultural areas themselves. And if we think about introducing or reintroducing trees back into these landscapes, there are several drivers that shape our thinking around whether or not that's a good idea and how we should go about doing that. So if our primary concern is biodiversity conservation, so biodiversity being the variety of living things, of plants, animals and fungi in the landscape, then we tend to think about, right, where should we place trees to provide the greatest habitat value? And that thinking is dominated by these two ideas, or it has been for a long time, ideas of land sparing versus land sharing. So those who advocate for land sparing say that we should take all the habitat resources out of active farming areas and place them in larger reserves so we can maximise the productive potential of farms and conserve larger continuous areas. Those that advocate for land sharing say ecologically we're better off integrating vegetation into the farms, integrating habitat, even if that means we have to expand the overall footprint of agriculture. If we're just thinking about productivity and we want to get the most out of this limited land base, then land sparing often seems like a pretty good idea. And that's because trees do tend to get in the way of some of these more industrial farming techniques. So things like centre pivot irrigators have been changing our landscape a lot. We've seen a lot of paddock trees, certainly in the Midlands, taken out to accommodate centre pivots, and that's what causes those circles in the image of the landscape. But also large bits of cropping machinery, seeding rigs, that find it hard to move around trees. However, if we want to keep producing commodities in these landscapes over the long term, we've got to think also about the longer term sustainability and risk of these strategies. And that's where I like to think about integrating trees, how it fits into the puzzle for me is about all the other things that trees do in these landscapes that are so important to their long-term resilience and sustainability and productivity. So not only are they helping to support biodiversity, but they're also protecting soils in many cases. They're helping regulate microclimates, water purification, all of these important things that we tend to sort of leave out of the picture. So in my work, I think about how can we integrate trees in these landscapes in ways that make sense in terms of long-term sustainability and also livability. These are places where we live and work, so important to think about that. So far in this course, I think most of our discussions and the situations we've been shown and been talking about have been focusing on woodlots, you know, sort of smaller scale or medium scale production forestry on farms and ways to bring that into the picture, whereas I'm more focused on ways that you can more closely integrate trees with other elements of the farm for mutual benefits. So whether that's a grazing or a cropping or a horticulture component. And that really is the broadest definition of agroforestry. And there are many ways that you can go about trying out agroforestry. These are a few examples I wanted to share. So on the left, there are 2 systems in Africa where timber is grown above shade-tolerant crops. In the top right is a system in Brazil that I visited, where they're growing trees for timber and for carbon, but they're also growing corn in between the trees, which are planted along contours, and they're grazing cattle. When they sort of rotate the corn, they're growing pasture and grazing under the trees. And then your classic beautiful Spanish oak or cork woodlands, where they finish these lucky pigs on the acorns and get incredibly high value pork products off these sort of what they call dehesa systems. This is what agroforestry often looks like a bit closer to home. So this is a farm in the Northern Midlands owned by a guy called Andrew Colvin and his son Simon. They've planted trees and they've retained trees on this property for a variety of purposes. They've got remnant patches up the back, which are mostly there for biodiversity. They've got windbreaks or shelter belts, which are protecting lambs from really cold, harsh winds that would otherwise reduce their condition or maybe even kill them if it's really bad. They've got productive woodlots where they're growing timber. That's part of a succession plan for the farm. Those trees are also addressing a soil waterlogging issue in that area of the property. And then some smaller scale biodiversity plantings. But what Andrew always told me every time I visited this place was that for him, it was the bird calls that he heard in the morning, it was the wildlife that he observed on the property, and all of that really increased his sense of enjoyment that he got from his day-to-day work and from living on the place. I've really focused in on windbreaks or shelter belts in my work, and I did that for a few reasons. They're really popular types of agroforestry in Australian landscapes, especially in places like Tassie where wind is a big risk factor. They're a very efficient way to address wind as a risk on a farm and provide shelter. So for the amount of space you're giving up, you get really effective shelter, and you can repeat or stagger shelter belts across a landscape. You can design them in lots of interesting ways to provide other sorts of benefits, so they're quite a flexible model of agroforestry. But they're not the only option, and so I just want to impress upon you that even though I'm going to talk about windbreaks a lot, I don't want us to limit our thinking and think that we've just got to plant trees in straight lines. There are lots of other options for integrating trees into farms. This just happens to be a very common and popular one, so it's one that I was able to do my experiments on because they already existed in the landscape. So just something to keep in mind. I'm not trying to promote windbreaks as the be-all and end-all, but there can be a good option. So if these systems are so fantastic and all the benefits that I've been speaking about are there, then why isn't everyone doing it? Why don't we see more agroforestry happening? Well, I think something that we're learning in this course and something we need to acknowledge is that it is hard work growing trees. You know, it can be very time intensive, it can be expensive, and then there's sort of ongoing costs as well, opportunity costs and maintenance costs. And so although there is a group of landholders and farmers out there who will always plant trees because they like doing it or because they think it's the right thing to do, there is also a large group who won't plant trees and might not even accept support to plant trees because they perceive that they're taking on an ongoing cost for something that doesn't or will not benefit them directly. So that can be quite a common mindset. And so what we thought about with this work was, you know, how can we, if we want to promote these systems and we want to encourage investment from individuals in planting trees, then we need ways of measuring and describing benefits or the value of trees on farms in ways that make sense to farmers and are meaningful to them. And for us, that was sort of looking at, right, how can trees boost productivity in other areas of the farm? How can they improve the resilience of the system to disturbances and improve livability as well? And the way that we went about thinking about it was to, you know, and this language here, asset, services, benefits, it all sounds pretty economic, and that's because a lot of my supervision was from economists. And you know, it's one way of looking at it, and it can help us think through some of these benefits that we want to capture. But don't be put off by that sort of this sort of very economic approach. I understand that there's a lot more to it, but we can think of woody vegetation on a farm as one form of asset, a natural asset. So things like soil and water, they're also assets. Vegetation can be thought of in the same way. That vegetation provides a range of services, so things like microclimate regulation, carbon sequestration, timber, biodiversity, and then the farmer derives benefits from those services. And those benefits can be really broad. There's a very long list, but just a few examples. We could think of increases in productivity. So for example, if you're providing habitat for pollinators and that were to increase fruit set in a horticulture crop, which increases yield. It could be an improvement to the overall value of the property. So there's a lot of research out there to suggest that a certain proportion of tree cover on a farm can increase its value. So that's one way of thinking about a benefit. There's ways that, or services that can improve the resilience of the whole farm to disturbances, and big ones are extreme weather events. So that could, the benefit there could be an avoided loss. So an avoided loss of stock during cold periods, or avoided crop damage due to winds. And there could also be access to higher value markets through compliance or certification schemes. So these are sort of the value pathways that we can think about. And a lot of the work that we did was reviewing or thinking of ways that you can measure those services and then value them. This is an example. While I was doing my research, there were some huge sort of hurricane-style winds coming through the Midwestern United States, and there were massive losses because these winds came through just before the grain harvest. And this is a landscape where there aren't many trees, there isn't a lot of shelter, so when these events are something that we could be seeing a lot more of in the future. There are ways that we can protect businesses or reduce risk or address risk by bringing trees into the landscape in really intelligent ways. So value is a term that can be interpreted in many ways, and I like to think of it with the broadest brush possible, thinking about this word value. Total economic value is a concept that's not mine, but it's one that I borrowed in my research, and I wanted to run you through some of the ways that we can think about the value of trees. Non-use values, so the ones over here on the right, they can be incredibly important drivers for investment in trees. These are things like knowing that future generations will have access to trees and nature's benefits, but also just existence value. A lot of people will plant trees just because they think trees deserve to be planted and they have an intrinsic worth. But it's this area of use values that I focused in on, because as I said, there's a lot of people who need this part of the picture, who aren't motivated by these non-use values. So there's a range of use values there. Consumptive values, so timber and other tangible products, they're quite easy to value, but it's these indirect use values that are a little harder to measure and value, things like pest control and water regulation and pollination. And to go from one complicated image to a much more intimidating one, this looks terrifying, but it's a map of values essentially. It's actually really straightforward. I'm sure you can't read it from there, but at the top you've got a windbreak, a shelter belt. Then you've got a range of services that thing provides. And these are all the smaller interactions that happen on the farm. So pathways of increases and reductions that eventually get you to some sort of benefit or value at the bottom. And this was a brainstorming process done with farmers, with academics, with agronomists, to figure out the whole suite of values and interactions that are happening when you plant a windbreak on a farm. I've got a copy of this up the back. I can send it around if you're interested, but this looks different in every business and for every different type of planting. So what it is an exercise that we can all go through when we think about planting trees. Think about the pathways to value that you're most interested in your specific context. What are your business risks, and how can trees help you address them? One example where we tried to fill in an information gap in this picture was we did some experiments to show that a shelter belt will reduce wind speed, but that then reduces evaporation on the leeward side, which leads you to pasture growth, an increase in pasture growth, which increases your pasture yield, and then you're likely to reduce supplementary feeding in that season if your pasture yield is improved. And that influences your margin at the end of the day. So we did a lot of research to actually measure pasture yield in these systems and show that you can get an increase there, and that the key driver there is reduced evaporation. So, we were trying to fill in gaps here, but there is still work to be done to add some data to this picture and actually quantify what's happening. So this is where all this information is captured in these papers, and I've got copies of them up the back, but I'm also happy to send them around. One of them looks very closely at dairy systems, so we really focused in on what are the key risks in dairy systems and how can trees help. So they're available to you if you want to really get into that diagram. The next piece of the puzzle, once you've figured out what your objectives and your values are, is thinking about what type of tree or what types of trees are going to best suit your objectives and do the best job at providing the services that you're interested in. And that comes down to the condition of the trees. So that's everything from how they've been planted, the extent of cover, but species selection as well. So the type of tree that you plant, we've talked a bit about this in the course already, can have an impact on the benefits you get out of it at the end of the day. And that's a big gap in our sort of evidence base when we think about valuing trees. We don't know that much. We know a lot about how the species choice will affect timber. That's where there's been a huge body of research. But in terms of how much it affects all those other services, there's still a lot of grey area there. And that's one thing that we wanted to really delve into. So we did this experiment where we looked at comparing the relative benefits or the relative value of 3 very common types of shelter belt. So these were radiata pine belts, Eucalyptus nitens, and then these mixed native belts. So these 2 pine and eucalypt belts, they were planted with forestry methods and forestry stock, but they were not given any care. So no silviculture, no pruning, no thinning. These were destined for a pulp market, so this was sort of a joint venture program. But they were providing excellent shelter, and that was really their job over the sort of time span that they were in the ground. They were really designed to provide shelter. The mixed native plantings are more your sort of standard Landcare funded biodiversity plantings. Again, these are just 3 common types. These are not your list of options for shelter belts. You can get really creative with designing windbreaks, and that's definitely, I think, the right way to go. But this was just a chance for us to test the assumption that species choice, at the end of the day, has a meaningful impact on the benefits you get at the farm scale. So to do that, we measured a range of structural attributes. So we looked at how the physical structure of these belts differed from each other, and we did that over time, so over various age classes. And wind speed was really important to figure out off the bat, because that's one of the key things that people were interested in. Wind speed reduction is determined by the height of a windbreak, but also its porosity. So it's really important to understand how wind moves through a stand of trees. What you don't want is no wind getting through at all, and all of it sort of heading over the top. Because what that does is creates turbulence in the lee, and that can be even more damaging than just your normal wind speed. So you want some wind to be able to pass through, but not too much. So there's this sort of sweet spot for porosity that you're aiming for with a windbreak. And how we measured porosity was to take lots of photographs and look at quantify how much light came through. So this image analysis technique. And we found that the pines and the mixed native belts, they were providing much more effective shelter. They had that sort of sweet spot of porosity up to a certain width. So if you planted too many pines, too many rows, you'd get too much wind blockage and that turbulent effect. But generally the sort of 6 or 7 row systems that we were looking at were pretty good. The eucalypts, on the other hand, they were sort of almost self-pruning. they were sort of losing their live foliage cover along the stem as they got older, and a lot of wind was passing through. So, you know, you need to account for that in designing a belt and putting in some shrubs or thinking about how structure changes over time. We looked at the percent cover at every sort of layer of vegetation. So this is sort of green is live cover, and the orange is dead cover, or the litter layer at the very bottom as well. And we found that, again, you're sort of getting these gaps a lot of the time in the lower layers of those sort of forestry style belts, whereas the shrubs in the mid-story do a great job at filling in those gaps in the mixed native belts. And that's not only important for shelter, but it's really important for biodiversity as well. So animals, as Ron will get into, I think, really, you know, need those lower layers of structure. We also measured height, and we measured stem basal area, and we measured carbon, and we used all of that data to generate this really simple, but I think useful scorecard as a way of showing, you know, how benefits change over time for these different types of plantings. And what you end up with is, you know, although the plantation style belts were quicker to get off the ground at the outset and they start providing benefits early on, eventually the mixed native belts sort of catch up and provide the greatest overall benefit. Of course, this assumes that all of these services are equal priorities on the farm. You know, this is a hypothetical case, again with three very oversimplified types of planting. So this looks different, again, depending on your priorities. If you think biodiversity is the most important factor, you know, that changes the picture. If shelter is providing a range of values, then you might weight that more heavily. But it's a way of illustrating that point of how important species selection is and how things can change over time. So we captured a lot of this in some papers as well, but what I wanted to go into is, again, thinking beyond shelter belts. You know, microclimate was a really key consideration in this work, but windbreaks, shelter belts are not the only way to do it. So we expanded the work to look at woodland systems and to figure out if you get the same sort of wind speed reduction and microclimate regulation with widely spaced trees. And we got great results. So this was a patch of remnant woodland on a farm, and up to about sort of 20-30% of our cover index, or tree cover, you were getting, you know, this sort of maximum wind speed reduction. And you know, wind was greatly reduced compared to out in the open pasture. So these are areas where the farmer can bring stock in, and because of that wind speed reduction, the minimum temperature was significantly higher than it was outside. So on a really cold day, stock are experiencing warmer temperatures in there, they're more protected. So this is one option. Another option, but a trade-off being that you know, it's harder to get in there and improve pasture. So other options are, you know, systems where you can get in and you can improve pasture, you can crop between trees. Again, this is that sort of silver pasture system in Brazil. A different climate, but just coming in today from Yei, we saw cattle grazing in a plantation on the side of the road, and so it's possible to you know, morph these systems in ways that suit your needs. This was a trial in Wales that I visited where they were growing different types of forage crops between widely spaced trees, and finding that, you know, their yields were improved. Instead of just separating a sort of forage crop system and trees, if you integrate them, they were getting higher yields overall. So microclimate is really important in farming, and trees can really help us maximize productive potential. Just quickly, I wanted to talk about this other experiment that I did, which was all about invertebrates in agriculture. So insects play really vital roles on farms, and they can be really front of mind for lots of growers. Pollination and pest management being the ones that have probably the greatest economic implications, but there's a range of things that insects do outside of that space. What we did was we went and trapped insects in transects away from shelter belts on the leeward side, and we looked at pitfall traps, so things that were running along the ground surface, but also things that were flying at pasture height using intercept traps. We repeated this through seasons on 9 different farms, ended up with about 1,000 samples. It was a massive workload to go through everything in the lab. With insect work, you really have to repeat and repeat because there's lots of noise in the data. Ended up with, I think, almost 500,000 tiny critters, which are now in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery as part of a big data set on Midlands biodiversity and how it's changing over time. But we separated them into functional groups depending on what they ate. And ended up with a whole heap of data, and you can ignore the detail here, but the point that I want to make is these different coloured shapes represent the different types of shelter belts, so pines, eucalypts and mixed native. And we can see that there's a lot of overlap, so a lot of insects are present across the board in lots of different environments. But then there are these key groups that are pulling the shapes away, and that's where we're seeing types of insects that have very particular habitat preferences. And so it does make a difference what type of tree you plant, but it depends on what goal you're trying to achieve. So some insects just want shelter in any form, whereas others are going to need specific habitat resources. So that was the key message, really. So the subtle differences between the types of shelter belt were things like specialists like scorpions. They were only found in mixed native litter. So there's something there that they need that's very particular. Pines, for some reason, seem to have significantly higher numbers of aphids, but also predatory lacewings. Beetles tended to be more abundant in mixed native belts, as were Hymenoptera, which are the bees, ants and wasps. So a lot of the beneficial things that we're trying to attract seem to find that structure pretty important. The relationship of abundance as you moved away from the shelter belt, so this is that 0 distance, so that's within the trees, and this is about 10 tree heights out, so beyond your shelter effect and out in open pasture. Often there was an edge effect, so this was native bees, and you can see that they're concentrating around the edges of mixed native belts. So often edges are really important habitat areas. There's all these interesting niches there, and there's different food resources. Shelter belts have lots of edges, but that seems to be an area that's really important to lots of invertebrates. Pollinating beetles, again, the edges were important, but we also found them in the interior of mixed native and eucalypt belts. Predatory beetles didn't care what you planted, they were just looking for somewhere to hide. So, especially in summer, I think they were looking for maybe shade or a sheltered environment. They were always in the middle of a shelter belt. Didn't matter if it was pines or how diverse it was, that was where they were finding what they needed. And finally, the most interesting one from my perspective was these major pollinators, European honeybees. None of them, they weren't hanging out inside the belts at all. I think their food resources are out in the paddock or out in the crop. But what they seemed to be looking for was shelter. So they were almost across every season, but especially in spring when it's windiest in this area, they were concentrated in the same area where we expect the greatest reduction in wind speed. So about sort of 5 to 10 tree heights out. So for some things, it seems to be more important that there's shelter provided. So it makes sense for bees. They need calm environments to forage in and be able to land on flowers. And this matched up with stories that farmers would tell me about greater pollination for brassica crops happening in this sheltered zone. So that was a really cool thing to have found. So essentially, you know, trees at these fine scales can affect the abundance of beneficial insects. That was sort of a key message. Some things really care about what you planted and others don't. But when it comes to thinking about what insects need in terms of habitat, some key things to consider, floristic diversity, so nectar and pollen resources if pollinators are your area of interest. Not to ignore the understory. So often when we plant trees, we don't think about planting grasses or sedges or ground covers, but those layers are really important for lots of invertebrates, especially parasitic wasps. Litter and woody debris, so lots of beetles really need that structure. And then again, I want to reiterate that ecology is complicated and there are some very specific interactions that take place. So some insects need a particular species of plant in order to survive. If you don't provide them with that, they're not going to be there. So you can get as particular as you like with this, and it depends again on your goals. Some practical tips to finish off on. Based on my limited practical experience, I spend most of my time sort of behind a computer and running experiments, but I think considering values and objectives from the start is a really valuable exercise. So mapping out those pathways, making your own version of that conceptual diagram, and thinking about what you want to get out of it. What are the risks in your farming business? What are the things that cause you headaches and make you lose sleep at night? And how can trees help you address those risks? Considering the site, so we've talked a lot about that. Configuration and rotation, where are you planting things? How long are they going to be there? And what happens next? Species selection, again, you know, it does matter. Think about structure, the physical structure of what you're putting in the ground, how that's going to change over time, and what that does in terms of your objectives. And then plan ahead, so it's really a 2-year process. You start thinking about what you want to achieve. You order from a nursery, you've got to give them time to grow from seed. Prepare your site, do the planting, and then those crucial, you know, early years of maintenance. There's a lot of time invested in that stage, so thinking well ahead. And I just wanted to leave you with a bit of inspiration. Think about creativity and innovation. This is Andrew Colvin again, the owner of Nossick, the farm that I showed you at the beginning. Andrew had a problem where he wanted to plant an additional strip of vegetation, so mostly shrubby, shrubs and understory plants, to provide one more layer of shelter as the wind would tear across his clover paddock. So protecting clover, but also lambs. But he also wanted his centre pivot to get across the whole paddock. So he wanted a fence that could bend. He needed to fence this area off from stock, but he wanted to let the rig pass through. So he had a couple of rigid fence posts in there, but where the wheels would cross over, he had these bendy fence posts. So the whole thing would travel over the shelter belt and the fence would pop back up. So, you know, you're only limited by your wild creativity, and this is a great example. There are so many ways that you can approach this and solve problems. So think laterally and, you know, make sure it suits your objectives.
I think to myself, what a wonderful